Good afternoon, and welcome to the second meeting of CHAOS, which is the Coastal Hazards of Superior Community Practice. My name is Melanie Perello, as Madison just said. I'm a NOAA Coastal Management Fellow at Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program, and I'm acting as the coordinator for this group. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We have a fairly packed agenda, but before that, I would be remiss in not giving you a little bit of background about what CHAOS is. So, can you see my screen? Okay. So CHAOS is a response to the impact of natural hazards that Minnesota and Wisconsin have been facing. And those hazards range from the high water levels that we talked about in our April meeting, coastal storms, erosion, which is a big focus of our meeting today, flooding, and some of these other hazards that have impacted our coastal communities. The aim of CHAOS is to help foster learning and sharing of information and collaboration between all of the different local governments, state agencies, federal agencies, stakeholders, and other organizations that have a role in helping us understand our hazard risks, know what steps we can take to mitigate those hazards, and have any type of regulatory role. We try to do this by having regular meetings. We are meeting quarterly, so our next meeting will be in October. We also are working on developing trainings and webinars, which is going to be a focus of our breakout sessions today, of having you help us identify what we should be focusing on for those trainings. And also we release a monthly newsletter. As a community of practice, CHAOS has members that are representing all different levels of government, stakeholder groups, and we have a good representation from Wisconsin and Minnesota. Got a couple people from Michigan who have joined in. And for today, we have 64 registrants. Most of you identified that you are a local government official or staff member. Following that, we had about 24% said you were involved in some type of consultancy, outreach, or specialty related to the coast. We also have a lot of natural resource managers, quite a few people who indicated an other response, whether it was a hazard mitigation or emergency management, or and a small percentage of people who are property owners or waterfront property managers. In kind of our geographic scale, we are focused on coastal Minnesota and Wisconsin, but we do have some representation from other parts of those states, and we also have some people from Michigan and Illinois joining us today. So for our agenda today, we're going to start off with Adam Bechle is going to do a presentation talking about shoreline protection, giving us this kind of high-level overview, and then we're going to move into breakout sessions, and we'll give a little bit more detail about what that's going to be, but that's going to be our opportunity to really engage with each other and have a good conversation about both what Adam has talked about and also about some of those training and resource needs that you have. And then we're going to end the day with some project highlights. And these are quick little updates on some existing projects that are working to help provide some resources and materials for you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Adam. I'm very excited that he's able to join us today. Adam Bechle is from Wisconsin Sea Grant, and he is a coastal engineering outreach specialist and joining us from the Madison area. And he's going to talk to us today about coastal hazards and a little bit more about shoreline protection. So I'm going to turn it over to Adam. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Melanie. I'm happy to be here today and be able to start us off and hopefully kick off some good discussion when we get in our breakout rooms. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video because I'm a pacer and it'll just be weird for you to watch me walking around the room. So I'm going to talk a little bit about coastal hazards, a little understanding of what some of the processes are before we talk about what some of the options are to address them, and then briefly touch on a few relevant educational resources. So the factors that go into one of the main problems we're seeing right now, which is shoreline and bluff erosion and recession, are natural processes to start with, which are shown on this screen. And this figure shows kind of the ways in which nature affects our coastal slopes and lower lying coastal areas. one of the main things that we're worried about right now is that interface between the lake and the land. So a big thing that affects our coast is the water levels and the waves that impact the coast. So just starting with a brief little update on where we are with Lake Superior water levels. I know the last time the group talked, we had a bit more extensive discussion, but this figure shows the latest Army Corps of Engineers 6-month forecast for water levels in Lake Superior. And so across the top, you will see the time that's depicted in this figure, starting from 2 years ago in 2018 up till present and 6 months into the future. This red line here is the recorded water level that's happened. The dashed blue line is the average water level from the 100 years of water level records we have. And then those numbers that go up and down on the top and bottom of the graph, those are the record high and record low water levels in the year in which those were set. So with that sort of context, most of you are aware Lake Superior was record-setting, especially in the summer last year and into the early part of the year. The good news is right now Lake Superior is about 4 inches below where the record level was last year. Still high, definitely, but not as high as last year. And the forecast into the future most likely is that they will stay below those record levels. So certainly not out of the woods yet in terms of water levels, but a little bit lower than last year, hopefully going back down to something more closely resembling average. So why do water levels matter so much? Well, so here we have a cartoon today. I'm going to try to cover, there's a lot of different landscapes in Western Lake Superior, so I'm going to try and cover a little bit of the different features we may see along the coast. But this is a depiction of a coastal bluff. And so when water levels are low, and we get a storm that creates waves on the lake, those waves might impact the base of the bluff, especially with a big storm. And when they impact the base of the bluff, they'll erode material away from it. But if water levels are high, like they are now, that gives those waves a starting point that's very, very close to the base or toe of the bluff. So when that same intensity of storm comes in, it can reach much higher up on the bluff and start to erode some of that bluff material. And it takes smaller storms to do that. So it gets impacted more frequently. So that is when we see waves hitting the toe of the bluff, removing material. Again, if it happens more frequently, it continues to remove material from the toe of the bluff. And then we end up with a somewhat over-steepened slope. And so the bluff slopes have a sort of happy place angle that they like to live at, which is dependent on what the soil composition is, how that soil is layered down. But as waves erode at the base of the bluff, we sort of get steeper than that happy place angle. The clays in Lake Superior, at least in Wisconsin, 14 degrees is about a happy place angle for those soils. And so even if water levels go down and we're over steepened, that slope is going to want to get back to that more flat angle. And how's it going to do that? It's going to start to collapse and put material back down towards the base of the bluff to get back to that more stable angle. Now, if water levels remain high, that newly slumped material gets taken away and sort of continues the process, and that failure can work its way up the bluff, and we see recession at the top. And so the bluff has sort of gotten back to its stable-ish angle, compared to where it started at, except it's moved back a few feet. We've lost some material. What I showed was kind of one way coastal bluffs can fail, kind of in a progressive sliding. Its failure works its way up the top. Depending on the material, on how it's layered, that'll change how slopes react. Some slopes can fail in a large slump, maybe only happens every 50 years, but it takes out quite a bit of land. Some slopes do the progressive way that I sort of illustrated in the cartoon. And then on shorter slopes, one slide may catch all the slope and move the crest back. It wouldn't necessarily be a huge slump, but it's a progressive moving back of the bluff slope. Now, moving into some of the rockier coasts, like the sandstones that are in some areas, we don't necessarily have to worry about the soil particles finding that stable angle because the material is rock, but the wave erosion, particularly on sandstone, isn't a super erosion resistant rock, so we might start to get undercutting where that failure then would be sort of a fracture and the falling of the rock. And some of the more erosion resistant materials, say on the North Shore, wave erosion will be the slowest of any of the situations we talked about. But perhaps if there's bedrock doesn't go all the way to the top, splash up over that bedrock, I know can be quite an issue and start eroding the land at the top of the bedrock. And then for those of you folks who aren't on bluffs, on low-lying areas, certainly erosion can be an issue, but then flooding becomes problematic, especially at high water levels, again, because that brings the water to such a closer starting point to do inundation when a storm comes through. So those are sort of how the land-water interface can affect our coastal lands. But that's not really the only thing that we have to worry about. One major thing that we kind of sometimes forget about is land coming from the coastal uplands. And so that can be problematic when we have concentrated runoff going down our coastal slopes that can erode soil particles as it flows downhill. And excessive groundwater can saturate our slopes, which can destabilize them. It makes the slopes less strong, and that happy stable angle has to be flatter to be stable if the soil conditions are wet. Also, as groundwater seeps out of a slope, it can actually directly erode the soil away as it flows down the slope. So we kind of got to worry about water interface with the lake, especially when water levels are high, but we always have to worry about water coming from the land down to the lake as it flows over our coastal lands. So those are kind of some main natural processes that can affect erosion and stability of our coastal lands. But we as humans have modified our coastal environments, and that can have a lot of implications. One thing is installing hardening shorelines with rock and things like that change the nearshore dynamics. It change how the waves interact with the coast, and it can also keep sediment from going into the lake and impact our beaches. There's not as much sediment supplying our beaches when we harden our shorelines. We put a lot of impervious surfaces. When we build a house, we put in a driveway that can increase runoff, change drainage patterns. And then as we develop, we certainly need to remove some vegetation to build a home or something like that. Sometimes we also clear cut vegetation and fully remove it. As I'll talk about later, vegetation has a lot of positive benefits to our shoreline, so doing vegetation removal can have a negative effect on shoreline and bluff recession. So I talk about this because we need to really understand at a specific site where you're worried about erosion, kind of what are the factors that go into it, because if you're missing something big, a lot of work can be done and a problem can still arise. So kind of understanding, certainly the high lake levels are at the forefront of all our minds, but we got to remember all these processes when we're putting a holistic solution together. So when it comes to protecting coastal investments, I like to give a top-down approach. Start at where the thing we care about is and work our way down to the lake, which is kind of the biggest fight we'd have to do, and see if we can start working on the problem from the top down. So from the top, some overview is managing land use, managing water and vegetation. Our practices that will help. As we work our way down the slope, things get a little tougher. It's not flat land anymore. We got to still manage water, vegetation, and the stability of that slope. And then as we get down to the lake, we have to potentially reduce wave impact if necessary. So getting into sort of this top approach, if you have a low-lying area, without doing any construction or fighting with the lake, one thing that can be done is purchasing flood insurance. It won't stop flooding, but it will definitely insure you against losses from coastal flooding. You do not need to live in the floodplain to buy it. That can dictate the price, but anyone can buy flood insurance. Most homeowner policies do not cover flooding, so it is sort of a big vulnerability if you don't have it but are at risk to flooding. With the water levels high, the risk is higher than in an average water level year. The cost doesn't reflect that. It's a pretty steady cost with respect to how lake levels fluctuate. So I always say it's sort of a value proposition now because your risk to flooding is higher, so you can get insurance to hedge against that. And then finally, hopefully I'm not kicking people out accidentally clicking on the Zoom functions, but most insurance, even flood insurance, will not cover erosion. Erosion is typically viewed as not a single event, but a continual process. So most insurance policies do not cover erosion. But as I say that, talk to whoever your agent is about that, because they'll have the final answer. This is just sort of general information. To find more about flood insurance, you can just do a web search for National Flood Insurance Program and go from there. But again, if you're a low-lying area at risk to flooding, this is definitely a consideration. It can be enacted relatively quickly, faster than you can construct something, and it'll give peace of mind. Moving on to things that you can do at the top of the bluff is managing land use, and this goes also for low-lying areas. And this figure depicts sort of a property's risk to erosion. A home is located some distance from active erosion. In this figure, it's X distance away. And erosion is occurring at some rate per year, R. The time at which erosion is likely to reach that asset, that home, is the distance divided by the rate. And that'll give sort of an estimate of how urgent an issue is. And so there's a few things you can do by understanding where a property or a home sits on a property with respect to the hazard. One, as I mentioned, you can figure out how urgent the issue is. If you have 400 feet and you're eroding at 1 foot per year, you have quite a bit of time before erosion can impact a property. Another thing is the easiest way to protect a property is not to build it in harm's way in the first place. Certainly not applicable everywhere if a building's already built, but managing development through the use of hazard setbacks can help ensure that new development gets placed a quote-unquote safe distance away from a hazard horizon. And this is calculated in a science-based way is how some of these hazard setback ordinances can be written. In this case, this figure is showing a couple components that might go into a hazard setback, which would be one, a recession setback that accounts for how much recession will occur over an expected lifespan of a building. Oftentimes people use 60 or 100 years. Stable slope setback that would account for how far back a bluff would fail to get to that stable, happy place. And then a facility setback, which is sort of like a buffer in case those other numbers are underestimated, or a buffer to allow actions to be taken. So I know that enacting ordinances is not always an easy thing to do, but for undeveloped areas, right now is kind of a time where it might be useful to think about that, because we're seeing so much property at risk and a lot of pain being felt. And if we can keep new properties from not feeling that pain, that's really the most effective way to protect them. Another thing you can do with this setback distance information is potentially relocate a building that's at risk, and using that safe setback estimate to do that. It's not an option on every property, but if you have sufficient space, as is in this picture from Sheboygan County, Wisconsin, this house got moved to the other side of the highway. The homeowner owned both pieces of property and was able to move their home back. Was the most cost-effective solution for them to put their house out of harm's way rather than maybe trying to fight Lake Michigan. So this can oftentimes be the most effective and cost-efficient way to deal with erosion, again, if there is sufficient land to move the home. Going to more process-based things that can be done to slow erosion, at the top of the bluff, managing water can be done in a couple different ways. One is directing runoff away from the edge of the bluff. So this photo shows a home that has downspouts pointed towards the edge of the bluff, directing that kind of concentrated roof runoff right over the edge of the bluff. So what was recommended was either get downspout extensions to run the water to the front of the house and away from the bluff, and possibly installing a rain barrel where you can capture that water and release it more slowly to do things like water plants, things like that. Minimizing impervious surfaces, so we reduce the amount of runoff and slow it down. Things like permeable pavers rather than a impervious concrete driveway could be an option. Intercepting perched groundwater. This home had relatively wet area, consistently wet area at the top of their bluff. They installed a French drain and routed that water into the base of a ravine to get that water out of the bluff and to stop causing problems. And then finally, directing wastewater away from the edge of the bluff. This home had a mound septic system installed right at the edge of the bluff, which is not a great idea for two reasons. One, every time you run the sink or flush the toilet, that puts water right where you don't want it in terms of the bluff stability. And two, it adds excess weight to the bluff, more force pushing down and causing it to be unstable. So they did actually end up moving that system to the front of the house, a little less curb appeal, but better for the lifespan of their home. The top of the bluff, again, maintaining and enhancing vegetation. Vegetation has a lot of benefits when it comes to the coast. One is those roots for deep-rooted vegetation hold the soil and add stability to the slopes. The plants themselves take water out of the soil and transpire them up into the air. And then the plants slow the flow of water down the slope, so it can reduce the speed that water's flowing down and the erosiveness of runoff. So some ways to do this is planting or maintaining deep-rooted native vegetation. This picture shows some roots at the edge of a bluff that are on the order of feet long compared to turf grass, which may be 4 inches deep and doesn't really hold much soil. At the edge of a bluff, instituting a no-mow buffer, bluff or really any coastal property, where you let the vegetation grow at least 10 feet from the edge of the bluff. That allows those roots to grow deeper and slow down water. If you want a nice view, clear cutting is not the best idea for bluff stability. Establishing a view shed where you kind of pop out a view through some vegetation maintains most of the vegetation. It's a good compromise. And then instead of cutting trees, there are ways you can prune them, as in this photo, where you can still get a nice view of the lake while maintaining that nice root system and the vegetative benefits of having the trees. So working at the top, managing land use, water, and vegetation. As we go to the slope, we're still going to want to manage water and vegetation as well as think about slope stability. Vegetation, same story, deep-rooted native vegetation. Trees aren't great on the slope of the bluff, but there's a lot of good native vegetation that helps in the same way I just talked about. If there's groundwater issues in and on the bluff slope, and you see, say, wet spaces, water seeping out, there are ways to drain that water out of the bluff slope and reduce those negative effects. Wick drains are one popular option. There could be some consequences there. I know in some instances they work too good and dry out the slope, and vegetation has a tough time establishing, so they're not a no-brainer, but it's definitely an option to consider and try and figure out how it could work if groundwater is a big issue in destabilizing a coastal slope. If there's an unstable slope, it can be reshaped to mitigate any failure that might occur. There's a couple different options. One is cutting the slope back on the top left. This takes quite a bit of land space to kind of cut the slope back to its happy slope angle. But if there's space, this can often be the most effective option. If space is an issue, say there's a home or the size of the lot isn't big enough to cut back to that stable angle, some combination of cutting and filling is an option. that's shown on the right to get material to that stable angle. Can be a regulatory challenge to fill that much material depending on how much needs to be done. And then on the bottom left there is using a terrace approach of retaining walls. So your retaining walls are providing some stability and saving you a little bit of space compared to the cutback approach above. So if there is an unstable slope and wanting to mitigate failure so there's no surprises, this may be, one of these options may be a way forward. So we've covered from the top of the bluff down the slope, and now we're at the interface with the lake. And if these options so far are not going to cut it, say there's no room to move the house, erosion is really encroaching upon a home, it's getting to be time that erosion needs to be slowed, then we can think about reducing wave impact. And so one of the most common ways this is done in the Great Lakes is with a revetment. The textbook definition is a shore parallel structure of sloped erosion-resistant material to protect the shore from erosion. This material is typically rock, but a revetment is more than just a pile of rocks on the shoreline. Certainly a pile of rocks on the shoreline does provide some erosion-resistant material, but that material is not being used the best way possible compared to this next slide, which is sort of a depiction of what an engineered revetment would look like. And so certainly this has some large stone, and that's called armor stone, which is intended to resist being moved by waves. But if you only have armor stone, as shown in this picture, those big stones have a lot of voids and spaces between them. And so the sediment underneath it can still leave through those voids, and every time waves come through, they'll take some material out. So adding something as shown on the right, like a filter layer of smaller stone will sort of fill those gaps and not allow sediment to leave. Other options are filter cloth, which serves a similar function. Again, keeping that underlying sediment in there while the armor stone is doing the work of resisting the waves. So graded layers, having armor stone as well as something to resist sediment leaving. These revetments are built on a slope, and common slope, as shown on the top right, is about 2 feet horizontal for every foot vertical. It can range from 2 to 1, 2 horizontal to 1 vertical, up to 3 horizontal, 1 vertical. Typically, it's not much steeper than that because then you end up with some stability issues, and the armor stone has to be a lot bigger to be stable on a steeper slope. And then looking down at the toe, if we just have a pile of rocks, it could see some toe scour from waves at the bottom, which cause erosion down at the base, and then that revetment material can sort of slide down the slope. So reinforcing the toe in this case is shown with extra armor stone will help lock that toe in place and mitigate that sort of failure mechanism that if it was just a pile of rocks on the shoreline could cause that structure to fail pretty quickly. So real briefly, some design considerations. How big is that armor stone going to be? It's not just something big. There's some thought that can go into it with an engineered revetment. It gets sized based on the wave climate, and oftentimes this can get dictated by how deep the water is. Deeper water allows larger waves. Waves break in shallow water, so oftentimes in the Great Lakes, the wave climate is dictated by the nearshore water depth. Again, that slope of revetment, steeper slope needs bigger stone, and potentially the impacts of ice depending on where you are. And then lastly, armor stone typically is we want to see angular stone because those pieces will interlock with each other. Smooth boulders don't interlock very well and need to be heavier to resist the forces of waves. And then finally, crest elevation, how high does this get built? A lot of the same considerations as goes into armor stone size, the wave environment, the slope of the revetment. Definitely needing to look for that filter layer. And then the toe protection. This shows a little bit different way to do it where there's excavation into the lake bed. and a stone is placed in there kind of to lock in the toe against moving. So this looks a little bit different than the previous slide. Both are viable options depending on where you are. So you definitely want to, if you're working on a revetment, see these sort of considerations being talked about to kind of get some confidence that this revetment will be durable and long-lasting and designed with these things in thought. So I say shore protection as a sort of last resort, and one reason is it's expensive. Another reason is you're changing the nearshore environment. And this is depicted here. A revetment was constructed in 2007. Prior to that, the long-term erosion rate in the area was about 1 foot per year. 5 years later, adjacent to the revetment, about 10 feet per year of erosion happened. And this was during a low water period. This is from Lake Michigan. So changing the nearshore dynamics, adding a hardened structure to a formerly natural shoreline changes how those waves interact and can cause increased erosion to adjacent properties. Some ways that this can be mitigated would be collaborating between different property owners. You still have some edge effects if everyone works together to build one continuous revetment, but you're not seeing a piecemeal approach where those edge effects are between a lot of houses. You can also realize cost savings here as well by mobilizing one contractor, one time, who may get better site access across a couple of properties. So working together and sort of recognizing what the impacts might be is definitely something to consider with shore protection. I'll quickly cover a couple other options just to kind of differentiate them from what a revetment is. So a seawall is a shore parallel structure of vertical material, oftentimes concrete or concrete block. This can reflect more wave energy, so we can get more of that scour impacts. A revetment with its slope will absorb a bit more wave energy rather than return it out to the lake and to neighboring properties. Breakwater, this isn't commonly used by residents, by property or private property owners, more maybe by municipalities, but it's an offshore structure that blocks wave energy rather than directly protect the shore from erosion. So it reduces the amount of wave energy reaching the shore. And then a little bit different style is a groin. This is a structure that's out into the lake. It's perpendicular to the shoreline, and its purpose is to trap sediment. So waves will move sediment along the shore of the lake. A groin sticks out into the water to catch sediment and build up a beach. And the flip side of that is on the side of the groin that doesn't build a beach is not getting supplied by sand. So you see erosion and recession there. So it also has its negative impacts on the shoreline. Finally, I'll talk about this a little bit later, is nature-based shorelines. This is sort of an emerging field in the Great Lakes. This is shore protection that incorporates vegetation or other natural features. This is an example of a stone sill where there's a small breakwater, then plantings of a marsh, and then a little bit more stone. This is in Marysville, Michigan. That was at low water levels, and this is at high water levels. Protects the shore from erosion, but it's not universally applicable. Whether it's appropriate depends on wave climate, water depth, and getting plants to survive. So again, it's an emerging area in the Great Lakes. There are things getting installed, but they're not as common as some of the other options. So it's an area of growth, I think, in shore protection. Some unsuitable shore protection, concrete rubble with rebar will tend to break apart and leave rusty metal on the shoreline. Poorly interlocked block, you suffer from the issue of having a lot of voids and sediment leaving in between that block. Just dumping over a slope is not a great idea. The blocks or the stone doesn't get interlocked or well placed, and then you're adding extra weight to the bluff slope. And then flat plate-like rubble, those things slide around. They don't interlock very well, and they're likely to break in half. Shore protection is not set it and forget it. It tends to need maintenance, and Lake Superior is rough on it. At the edge of a revetment, you can get erosion flanking behind the revetment as the waves kind of bend around the edge of a revetment. Armor stone eventually can get cracked, and in this case, this piece is busted into thirds, so that the weight of that stone is much less than what it was designed for, so it's not going to stand up very well to waves. Those slopes with enough storms can get destabilized, and then if they're destabilized enough, you get gaps in structures. When they get put to the test by big storms, significant erosion can occur. And so underscoring that maintenance of shore protection structures is needed for long-term function. They're not erosion proof or wave proof, they slow erosion. So looking at, just stressing to look at sort of this top-down approach and consider what you can do to manage land use, manage water and vegetation. Those are going to be issues all the time. And then if push comes to shove, looking at shore protection to reduce wave impact if it's necessary, if those other options can't get you to protecting the coastal investment. There's more information on a lot of this in a handout that we put together on a website at Wisconsin Sea Grant. If you just do a web search for resources for Great Lakes coastal property owners, there's a lot of good information that's linked to there. Two things I want to point out in particular. One is a fact sheet about working with engineers and contractors on shore protection projects. Guides through a lot of the considerations that may be new compared to other projects like road construction, things like that. And then certainly these things need to be permitted in many cases. So at least for Wisconsin, we have a link to the DNR page on placing erosion control structures on the Great Lakes in Wisconsin. So with that, I will end my talk, and I think we have a little time for questions.
Hi, Adam. We went over a little bit, so we're actually going to go ahead and launch a poll. What we're asking you is to help identify some of the things that Adam just brought up in his presentation. What do you want to hear more about in a future webinar or training? So that poll should be popping up in your screen. And if you do have questions, please submit those in the chat, and we will get those to Adam and get a response for you. So I'm looking at what we're getting in so far. See a lot of responses for coastal vegetation management, very popular. Shoreline protection structures, more detail on that. Slope stabilization, managing land use and setback ordinances. Let's see. All right. Let's see. We've got about 70% responses, so please, if you have a second, go ahead and put in your response. And what we're going to move into for next is we're going to go ahead and move into our breakout sessions. So this is what I think is probably the best part of our meeting. This is a time where we get to engage with each other, introduce ourselves, and we're going to talk in smaller groups, reflecting on Adam's presentation. So this is also a place where we can ask some of those questions, and we'll work to get your responses. And your facilitator is going to be in that room with you and is going to go over some questions about trainings and case studies that we need to help identify, and if there's anything that you can bring in to CHAOSS. So I'm going to go ahead and move it over to Madison. She's going to help explain the process for moving into a breakout session. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that was a productive breakout session. I know we got cut off when we were just making our last comments. If there's something you'd like to share with the group, we do have that chat box, so please put it in the chat box. And all the facilitators, we were taking notes. We're going to share those with everyone afterwards. And we're going to take the feedback that you provided today and use that to help design future trainings and webinars that we can offer through this group, and also for content for case studies and other examples that we look for to focus on in future meetings. Okay. So let's see, I've lost where I'm at. So we're back, and for the last part of our meeting, we're going to do some quick project highlights. I'm going to start off, just give a quick little highlight of a project that I'm involved in, and then we're going to move into some other really cool projects around the coast. So just a little background on myself. So I'm a NOAA Coastal Management Fellow working here in Minnesota for the Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program. And my project is has three main parts. The first part is actually helping set up this community of practice so that we can help reach many of the local communities and stakeholders who have an interest in coastal hazards and try to help provide trainings and other learning opportunities and sharing opportunities for all of you. Another aspect is I'm involved with a coastal erosion hazard mapping group, which our next speaker is going to give a lot more detail about that, but I'm helping to do some mapping here in Minnesota. And then the third part of my project is that I am working on outreach development here for Minnesota, trying to provide more resources that are focused on Lake Superior, and with a big emphasis here on Minnesota. So part of that is we're working on a property owner's guide, as well as a guide for people who are considering buying coastal property, so they understand some of those options that Adam talked about today, but also just some of the more the regulatory side here locally. I'm also working on some fact sheets and other trainings that we're going to be offering over the next year that are geared more towards local government and property owners and realtors. So I'm going to go ahead and stop talking. If you're interested in learning more about what we're doing with that fellowship project, please reach out. I'm going to provide my contact details in the follow-up email after the meeting. And if you're interested perhaps in being part of a review committee for any of those materials, or you'd like to contribute anything, let me know. So I'm going to hand it over to Charlie Moore, and he is going to talk about coastal erosion hazard mapping for Minnesota. So Charlie, you should be able to share your screen.
Charlie, you're muted, so just might need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I got screen sharing working, but I needed to unmute. Hi, I'm Charlie Moore. I'm at ARDC, the Senior GIS Specialist at Arrowhead Regional Development Commission. We're a regional planning organization that works in Minnesota's Arrowhead region. That's 7 counties. And right now we're working on a project called Coastal Erosion Hazard Mapping. This is a project we have in partnership funding with the Minnesota Lake Superior Coastal Program. A lot of our members are attending this meeting, I think, today, a lot of the folks involved. So yeah, I'm just going to give kind of an overview about the project that we're working on. The vision right now for this project is to develop a dynamic erosion hazard map through methodology utilizing the latest data to create a reliable vetted process and informs local stakeholders and ordinances to guide land use infrastructure and related decisions along Minnesota's Lake Superior coast. So this is the North Shore, Minnesota's coast. And ultimately, this is developing a GIS layer that shows areas that are susceptible to erosion. Erosion facts, I think we went over a lot of this previously, but we're looking at how shoreline affects landowner and property values, public infrastructure, water quality, habitat for critical species. We all know that there's rising water temperatures leading to more storm events causing erosion, and higher water levels that are increasing, which leads to increased wave action, causing erosion. Some of the past efforts that have been looked into to calculating this erosion rate and finding where areas are susceptible to erosion. In 1988, the North Shore Management Board, which is a group of local government authorities along the North Shore, recommended erosion be assessed in their North Shore Management Plan. And then that was mapped in 1989 based on aerial photography comparison. So that's taking images, actual photographs, and measuring from different years. We had 1930, 1975, 1988, and measuring the differences in where the shoreline falls across those old photos. And this was done back then and is the current erosion hazard layer that Minnesota is working with on their North Shore. And so kind of moving forward, there's definitely a need of updating this shoreline. We have more available technology, more GIS that can be incorporated into it. So the Coastal Programs grant was secured by North Shore Management Board's One Watershed, One Plan implementation. And that started in 2017 and was conducted by the Soil and Water Conservation Districts along the North Shore. And the project began in April of 2018. So we've been working on this for a few years now. This is a map of kind of what we're analyzing here. This is the old data from the original report from 1989. You can see, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but high, low, and unknown erosion potential is what has been identified from that older 1989 study. This is a black and white scan. I believe there's a color version available on our website that I'll share later. But you can see areas where there's high erosion potential and low erosion potential and unknown over here. So that's kind of the data we're working with. We're hoping to get a little bit more detailed with this update of the plan. So the current efforts, it's time for an update. Lake and Cook County, like I mentioned before, organized a group in summer of 2018 to discuss erosion, which has evolved into this CHEM project, CEHM. There's a list of our members: North Shore Management Board, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, ARDC. We have folks, professors from UMD, Lake Superior Coastal Program, Lake Cook and St. Louis counties, NOAA, and FEMA are all involved in this project. So it's a group of us that gets together to kind of discuss the details of creating and analyzing this mapping layer. Here's a quick overview of our phases. Phase 1 is actually complete. That was basically gathering all the data sets. This is it's available on our website. We have a link that shows basically the relevant data sets relevant to coastal erosion along the North Shore. It's an interactive mapping tool where you can view, like, again, that 1989 data, parcel data information, geology information, oblique photos, historical photos. So we have it kind of combined all into this one site where you can access it and kind of view relevant information for that. Phase 2 is where we're currently at. That's basically developing the proper methodology and testing that methodology on test sites. And I'll get into quickly specifics of that. And then phase 3 gets into addressing additional gaps. That's basically running the analysis on the entire shoreline of Minnesota's Lake Superior North Shore. And then phase 4 is ongoing outreach, providing information to local stakeholders, landowners, project owners, anyone developing or living on the coast of Lake Superior. So it's a 4-phase process. We're currently in phase 2, and we're looking at shoreline testing methodology. So we've settled on a methodology that is called the DSAS tool, Digital Shoreline Analysis System. This is a plugin for Esri's ArcMap, and we're looking at 5 different test sites currently: Silver Creek, Castle Danger, Brule River, Grand Portage, and Park Point. This is in partnership with the Minnesota Lake Superior Coastal Program. And so what this DSAS tool does is it measures rate of change statistics between multiple years of shoreline to determine erosion rate. So kind of the process that we're in right now is digitizing bluff edges of historical images, some that need to be a georeference and some that don't. You can see from this photo here, we have these kind of red lines are different years of shoreline data, and this DSAS tool calculates a baseline and then transect lines that intersect perpendicular to these old historical shoreline data sets, and then calculates the rate of change in between these to determine areas that are susceptible to erosion. So that's kind of where we're at. That's a little overview of our project. If anyone's more interested, we have a website, ardc.org/CEHM, that provides a bunch of different tools and resources. Again, like I mentioned, that phase 1, that mapping tool that shows different data sets where you can play around and see areas that look at data sets relevant to erosion, you can contact me. Also, Justin Otzi, I believe, is on this call, is the project lead for this. He's a senior planner at ARDC, and those are contact info. So, any other questions, let me know.
Thank you, Charlie. I don't see any questions so far, so let's go ahead and our next project update is from Adam Bechle. So we can go ahead and let him share his screen. He's going to talk to us about that issue that has been brought up about nature-based shorelines. You're muted, Adam.
I'm muted. Okay, double muted, phone and Zoom. So I touched on this a bit in the presentation, and it definitely came up in the group I was in, but nature-based shorelines is a big area of interest. And at Wisconsin Sea Grant, we have essentially a draft of a guide of nature-based shorelines for Wisconsin's Great Lake coasts. It's an upcoming booklet from Wisconsin Sea Grant. And the goal was to sort of, there's not much information about nature-based shorelines in the Great Lakes, what's possible, what's been done. And so the goal of this booklet is just to give that initial overview. It's not a design how-to guide, but to sort of at least give the picture of what's realistic. And so this is sort of our summary graphic. I don't expect everyone to read through it and interpret it. But basically what we've done is took somewhat of a broad definition of what nature-based shorelines could be and how you could incorporate natural elements into shore protection, classified into 6 categories: vegetation, kind of beach nourishment and slope stabilization with vegetation, edging, sills, and then conventional gray infrastructures that are enhanced for ecological benefits. And tried to kind of rate these against each other based on a couple criteria you would have to consider of whether it'd be appropriate. What are the environmental benefits? What sort of coastal slopes could you use them on? Steep slopes are tougher. Relative cost. And then one of the biggies in the Great Lakes is the wave energy environment. These aren't all going to work on the open coast of Lake Superior, but being realistic about that and what some options are out there. And then maintenance requirements, because these are living elements, making sure that they survive and can perform their function. So as kind of a sneak peek at what it will look like, sort of for each of these options, we have a description, kind of what those ratings are, kind of what this option is, and then some of the benefits and challenges relative to each other. And then we tried really hard to find case studies from across the Great Lakes. And as I said, this is a kind of an emerging field. So the case I showed was from Marysville, Michigan. It was on the St. Mary's River, so not the open coast of the Great Lakes, but they did replace steel sheet pile with something that's a bit more nature-based and provide some habitat. So going into kind of what the design considerations were, how it's performed, what the maintenance were, to put this term nature-based shorelines a little bit more tangible for folks to understand. So again, we've got a draft. We need to sort of edit it and get it produced, but this is kind of what we have coming. So there's definitely more work to do on nature-based shorelines in the Great Lakes, but hopefully this is a start.
That looks excellent. And if you have any questions for Adam, definitely use that chat box. But otherwise, we can go into, we have one more project highlight. That is Karina Heim is going to talk to us about the Lake Superior High Water Spotter.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I'll just take a couple minutes to share with you this new photo collection tool that this CHAOS group has developed. And I'll share my screen in just a moment and show that to you. But as has been very well established, we are still in a sustained period of high water here in Lake Superior Basin and Great Lakes wide, which has led to a lot of infrastructure inundation, property damage, and some of that is due to some of the infrastructure that has been built and investments that have been made during times where water levels were lower. And now those areas are exposed to the hazards and the energy of a higher water system. And so, you know, we've sort of taken note over this period of high water that there's a need to establish a better record and documentation of the conditions and impacts that we're seeing during these times of high water, so that we can establish a better institutional memory and understanding of what this lake is capable of during high water, and hopefully establishing that record will lead to you know, some better tools and resources to make good decisions and investments about infrastructure and land uses now and in the future. And so one way to establish better documentation is through photos and through a better visual record of the impacts that we're seeing during high water times. And so I'm going to now I'll share my screen here. So yeah, you're seeing my screen, I'm hoping. Yeah, so to that end, that's where the Lake Superior High Water Spotter tool comes into play. So this was just developed this summer. It's a photo collection portal where anyone can submit a photo image of Lake Superior from a vantage point at the shoreline. And we're hoping that you are inspired to maybe be spotters as well after getting oriented to the tool here. So right now, this is a CHAOS initiative, but the tool is housed on the Lake Superior National Estuarine Research Reserve's website on this page here. I think Melanie's going to put the link in the chat box so you can, of course, bookmark it on your own computer. But this landing page here talks a little bit about the project, and then there's a button right here where you can link right to the form where you yourself can submit water level photos. So I'm going to try to scroll over there right now. Okay, so so if you click on that share photos button, you get right to this form here, which again explains the project. But if you scroll down, there's a real simple spot here where you can submit your own photos of Lake Superior water or Lake Superior from the shoreline. You can either take a photo right then and there if you're using your phone, or you can submit a photo you've already taken. The only two required elements on this page, I believe, are the photo itself. There's three, sorry. You must submit a photo. You must then drop a pin on the map here of an estimate of where that photo was taken and your best estimate of when that photo was taken. We are hoping to then, if you have the time, collect some additional information from folks who submit photos, such as details of the location where you are standing or sitting where you took the photo, and you know, anything else you'd like to share about the conditions, and then a series of questions about the conditions that you've observed at the site. So I'll just scroll through them here, but just collecting a little bit of additional information along with the photo itself. So that's really it. It's a pretty simple form tool, but I wanted to show you what it's all leading to. We've had a few photos submitted already. There's a public-facing map that I think Melanie will also link to in the chat box that you can then go ahead and get in there and see some of the great photos that have already been taken. So I'll just scroll through a couple here. We've had several from the Twin Ports area, a couple from up the North Shore, and some from over in the Ashland Bayfield area already. And again, I think, you know, I just want to emphasize, these don't have to be professional photos. They're just, and they don't have to be during extreme conditions. It's just capitalizing on this moment where we are still in high water times to establish that visual record, which we hope can then, is that these photos can then become a really important outreach tool in the future. So that's the high water spotter. Appreciate your help in being spotters if you've got any photos at all to share. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to field them.
So I can attest it takes very little time. It really takes about a minute to fill out that form. And if you can save that on your phone, you could just do it while you're out and you can directly take your photo. on your cell phone and insert it right into the form. So we have a couple of minutes if there are any questions, and we have the links already in the chat box to access the high water spotter.
I have a question.
Yes.
The high water spotter is so cool. Great job, Karina. And Melanie shared it with us, and I was thinking about how it's, in some ways, it's similar to the National Weather Service request for information. Is there any way that through the spotter you could also have a direct link or upload to make it easier so people are also submitting information to that? Because that'll help the Weather Service predict coastal storm impacts.
You just reminded me of something I forgot to do, Julie, which was add that link into the thank you portion after you've submitted the photo. And I have been in contact with Joe Moore, so he knows this exists. But I think that's a great idea to add that link and prompt folks if it's a storm-related photo to also add there. And I'll also plan to share all of this with Joe too. But thanks for reminding me.
Thank you. There's so much need for information, so the more we can kind of streamline it for the public, I think the better off we'll be, rather than throwing so many things at them. But yeah, just coordinated on the front end sounds great. I'll check it out. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Okay. Well, if not, I want to thank everyone for attending today, and especially want to say a lot of thanks to everybody who spoke today: Adam Bechle, Charlie Moore, Karina. Thank you so much for your participation. A special thanks to Madison Rodman from the University of Minnesota Sea Grant for being our host today, and for everyone from the Chaos Steering Committee for volunteering as facilitators. Again, we are recording, so we will be able to post this information up onto Wisconsin Sea Grant's YouTube page. So you'll be able to go back and watch this. And I know a lot of people have said that they'd like to be able to go back and see Adam's presentation again. Please share that with anyone that might be interested. And we will share all of the slides and other resources and links that were mentioned today with all of you in a follow-up email. So if there's anything else, please speak up, but otherwise, thank you so much for attending.